Welcome to this webinar on supporting pupils with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This session was originally delivered for the Secondary INSET on the 15th of March 2024. And my name is Dr. Adhd. I'm an education and child psychologist working for Xavier Catholic Education Trust. In this session, we're going to cover what is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, what does it look like in the classroom, how can you support students with ADHD, and also looking at the strengths of students with ADHD as well. We're going to start with a game of true or false, just to do a bit of myth busting around some of the common misconceptions about ADHD. So you may like to take some time to pause the video at this point to consider the true or false of these three statements. If you're on your own, just to reflect on your own, or if you're in a group, you can do this as a wider discussion. But the 3 points are, firstly, hyperactivity is always a part of ADHD. Number 2, ADHD mainly affects males. And number 3, you can grow out of ADHD. The answer for number 1, hyperactivity is always part of ADHD, is false. So ADHD does stand for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And between 1980 and 1987, they did bring in something called Adhd, which was attention deficit disorder without the hyperactivity. However, since 1987, they've just had this label of ADHD, which covers everything, and that can be part of 3 different presentations. One presentation is the inattentive type, which would be the attention deficit but not the hyperactivity. You've then got the second presentation, which is the impulsive and hyperactive type presentation, and then you've also got combined type that is inattentive, hyperactive and impulsive. So hyperactivity is not always part of ADHD if you've got the inattentive type. Number 2, ADHD mainly affects males. That one, you can have a point if you've said true or false. So it's true in that the statistics suggest that 2/3 of those who are diagnosed with ADHD are males. However, as is more well documented with autism, it's thought that actually female presentation is slightly different than the male presentation, in that female presentation is much more likely to be the inattentive type, which is less obvious and less easy to pick up than the hyperactivity impulsive type. And therefore it's thought that maybe the figures are more even, but just that there's a bit of an overdiagnosis perhaps with the males and underdiagnosis with the females. Number 3, you can grow out of ADHD. I imagine that most people said that that is false. However, it's not actually as clear cut as that. So for the vast majority of people, as they grow, their symptoms will continue to be there. So it's thought that the research suggests that in about 9 out of 10 cases, people will have symptoms of ADHD throughout the lifespan. But what they have found is that when they look at the brains of children with ADHD in comparison to neurotypical children, and then tracking those over the brain development up until when the brain is kind of thought to be fully developed around the age of 25, whilst there are quite significant differences in the brain of children with ADHD, by the time the brain is fully developed, those differences are much less obvious. And what adults with ADHD tend to find is that maybe for some adults their symptoms carry on as they had before, and for other adults with ADHD, their symptoms can change slightly, maybe become slightly less obvious. For some, the symptoms can seem to go away, but then also seem to come back. So it's thought that for the vast majority of people, it's a lifelong condition. And some people argue that for the 1 in 10 where those symptoms do seem to disappear, that perhaps actually they didn't have ADHD in the first place, and there might have been other reasons for their attention deficit. So again, really the answer is probably false. If you said true, you can also have a point. Before we delve into what we mean by ADHD, I think it's really important to think about all of the other things that can impact on attention within the classroom, because there are so many things that it can impact on attention that are not part of a neurodevelopmental condition like ADHD. So, for example, teaching style can impact on attention. Having specific learning needs, if you have a learning need that makes learning much more difficult for you, then it's also going to be more difficult often to concentrate and focus for a long period of time because you're having to work that much harder. If you have processing difficulties where it takes you longer to take in information, that can impact on attention, because again, you're having to put in so much more focus and attention and effort into understanding what you're hearing. Trauma can impact on attention, because often children who've experienced trauma within the classroom, they might be in survival mode where they're hypervigilant to things around them, they're spending a lot of time in fight or flight, their brains aren't sort of ready for learning, and they're much more focused on survival rather than learning. So trauma can definitely impact on attention. Motivation, do they want to be in your lesson? Are they motivated by that subject? That certainly has an impact. Emotions, again, if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling overwhelmed by intense emotions, then you're less likely to be able to pay attention. Health conditions like ADHD, but also things like epilepsy, and if you're having absent seizures, for example. Hearing and vision. Language needs, if you have receptive language difficulties or you're speaking English and listening to English as an additional language, again, takes so much more effort to be able to do that can impact on attention, and it's easier to zone out. Environmental factors like sensory overwhelm within the classroom. Also basic needs. So we all know, don't we, if we're hungry, if we're tired, if we're hot, if we're cold, if we've just eaten a big lunch, then paying attention is much more difficult. But we're going to spend the rest of this session really focusing in on ADHD. So some basic facts about ADHD. It stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's a neurodevelopmental condition, so it's something that happens within the brain. As the brain develops, there's differences within the way that the brain develops over time. It's thought that there's a genetic component, although it's not fully understood. The causes of ADHD aren't fully understood. It seems to be more common in boys, according to statistic, although we've talked about some of the issues around that. 9% of children in the UK have a diagnosis of ADHD. We've talked about the three main presentations. So it's characterised by inattention, hyperactivity and impulsivity. You've got the inattentive presentation, the hyperactive and impulsive presentation, and the combined type. And then finally, one of the key things when you're being diagnosed with ADHD is that it needs to impact on your daily functioning and quality of life. When we're thinking about ADHD, I think it's really important to understand about the differences that have been found by researchers in terms of the ADHD brain in comparison to a neurotypical brain. So what they've found overall is that the ADHD brain is roughly 3 years behind in terms of the neurodevelopment. They've also found that structurally some areas of the brain are smaller in ADHD brains. So there is a smaller cerebellum, that's the part of the brain that's in charge of movement and balance. There's also a smaller amygdala and hippocampus. The amygdala is really key in terms of emotional reactions, emotional regulation, and the hippocampus is involved in memories and emotional memories. And then the prefrontal cortex as well is the part of the brain that's in charge of higher order thinking and what we call executive functioning skills. And that involves things like planning, organising, rational thought, reasoning, logic, being able to shift your attention from one thing to another, being able to regulate your emotions, being able to regulate your behaviour. So it's involved in so many different things that are so important within the school environment. And what they've also found is that the neurotransmitters, which are the things that send messages between different parts of the brain, dopamine and noradrenaline, they are both lower as well in the brains of children with ADHD. And those two things play a really important role in things like impulse control, movement, regulation of sleep, which can be really difficult for children with ADHD, where they find it really difficult to fall asleep and then stay asleep, which then has an impact on their emotional regulation, their behavioural regulation, their executive functioning skills, and also noradrenaline, which is really key in attention. So what does this look like in the classroom? According to the NHS, these are some of the symptoms that you're likely to find in the inattentive type for ADHD and also the hyperactivity and impulsive type. So starting with inattentiveness, the things you might see are having a short attention span and being easily distracted, making careless mistakes, for example in schoolwork, appearing forgetful and losing things, being unable to stick to tasks that are tedious or time-consuming, appearing to be unable to listen to or carry out instructions, frequently changing activity or task, and having difficulty organising tasks. Hyperactivity and impulsiveness, that might look like difficulty standing still, especially in calm or quiet surroundings, constantly fidgeting, difficulty concentrating on tasks, excessive physical movement, excessive talking, difficulty waiting their turn, acting without thinking, interrupting conversations, little or no sense of danger, and emotional dysregulation. And all of these fit in with those differences in the brain that were outlined in the previous slide. So thinking about those differences in the brain and thinking about the symptoms that we see, I think it's really important to reflect on how much of a challenge the classroom environment is for a pupil with ADHD. Because before they even start on the learning, just the general baseline expectations in our classrooms are to be quiet, to sit still, to be able to focus their attention for extended periods of time sometimes, to avoid getting distracted by all of the sensory stimulation around them, by all of the other 30 children that are in their class, being able to regulate their emotions, and then also being able to regulate their behaviour. So they're actually quite big asks for a child with ADHD before they even start on the learning. And these are some quotes now from people with ADHD and how they describe their experience. So one person said, living with ADHD is like being locked in a room with 100 televisions and 100 radios all playing. None of them have power buttons, so you can't turn them off, and the door is locked from the outside. Another person said, ADHD is being told you're too much while simultaneously feeling like you're not enough. And then this person said, the thing about ADHD is it's actually great. I love the way my brain works. I'm funny and flexible and creative and adventurous. My frustrations come from trying to force my ADHD brain to work in a non-ADHD world. And that's where we come in thinking about how we can create a classroom that is more ADHD friendly, and so that people aren't feeling that way. So I wanted you to take some time to reflect on the phrases that you think that pupils with ADHD frequently hear directed towards them in the classroom. If you're on your own, maybe just have a think about this and pause it for a moment, or if you're with a group, maybe you could discuss this as a wider group. The chances are that the kind of things that you were just talking about were phrases like pay attention, stop talking, stop moving, sit down, be careful, be quiet, you're not trying. And statistics suggest that by the age of 10, children with ADHD have received 20,000 more negative messages and critiques than their peers without ADHD. And obviously that is going to impact on their motivation, their self-esteem, their relationships with teachers, their enjoyment of school. So now we're going to think about a case study. This is Jack. Jack will remind you of lots of pupils, I'm sure, that you work with within your schools. So he is in year 9, he has a diagnosis of ADHD and finds it almost impossible to sit still and listen in lessons. He gets out of his chair at every opportunity, he's often not on task, he's often shouting out, and as a result is frequently in trouble with the teacher. I'd just like you to take a moment to pause the video and think about what you could do as a teacher, as a teaching assistant, or whatever role you have in the school. What could you do that might make life a bit easier for Jack? Right, now that you've had a chance to think about what you would do, we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about what strategies can help, and I'm sure you would have come up with lots of these things and more. These were originally put together for secondary teaching assistants, and so if you're a primary school teacher, a lot of these will still be relevant, but there might be other things that will be relevant as well. And equally, if you're a secondary teacher, there may be lots of other things that you'll be able to do. But this session was really just focused on the things that perhaps a teaching assistant might be able to control and support with. So the first one I've got here is about encouraging the child to sit at the front with their back to the class. Different seating positions suit different children. However, for children with ADHD, what you want to minimise is distractions around them. So generally sitting at the front where they've got nothing in their eye line between them and the board is a positive thing. preferably away from the window and away from the door, away from anywhere where there's going to be lots of children walking past them. All of those things tend to be quite helpful, but it does depend on the pupil, because you may have a pupil that turns around a lot to talk to people around them, and so actually sitting them at the back can be better, but you as the member of staff or someone that knows them well will be the best person to judge that. It may be as well that for some pupils they have 2 seats within the class. If you've got the space to be able to do that, they might have one that's right at the front so that they can attend on the input and get those non-verbal prompts really easily from you to encourage them to listen. But then when they're getting on with individual work, it may be that moving to a different seat where they've got minimal distractions around them, perhaps sort of facing towards a wall where it's kind of blank and they've not got those distractions around them. That can be quite helpful as well. But I would make all of those decisions in collaboration with the pupil, because they will be able to also perhaps tell you where they work best. The second thing is about providing sensory support. So it may be in the form of fidgets. If you've got a pupil that's always fidgeting and finds it easier to listen when they've got something in their hands, and that might be a fidget toy, it might be a piece of blue tack, it might be that they just need to doodle, but that genuinely helps some pupils and doesn't distract them. It actually allows them to focus their attention and listen better, even if they're not tracking you with their eyes. Other sensory support, depending on the kind of behaviour that you're seeing, so it might be that you have a pupil who's rocking on their chair constantly, in which case, or they might be kind of moving their legs all the time, in which case things like chair bands and cushions on their seats can give them that sensory input that they're seeking and help them to be able to attend better. Minimise distractions around them. So we talked a little bit about that in terms of the seating, but also thinking about their desk. Have they got stuff everywhere that's going to impact on their ability to focus, in which case helping them organise their workspace can be helpful. And also if they've got things like worksheets, just making sure that you're covering up for them or supporting them in covering up some of the questions, so they've just got one thing to look at a time, rather than having to be overfaced with lots of things and then struggle to really hone their attention in on what they're doing. Embedding routines, consistency and predictable boundaries can all support with the emotional regulation, and just understanding and seeing that big picture of where they are and being able to regulate their behaviour. Giving pre-warnings of change, again, helps with that planning and organisation and the executive functioning skills that children often find difficult. Cue them in visually, because what we're trying to avoid is those verbal prompts which can end up feeling like criticism. So if you can cue them in visually by just a little tap on the shoulder or a little tap on the desk, or a really subtle and kind visual prompt, then that can feel a lot better in terms of the self-esteem. It may just look like if you're able to sort of standing close to them, can be enough just to cue them in. Break the instructions down into small chunks. That can help, and having things like a task board, so you can see this task plan on the left hand side of the screen, really breaking down for them at the start of the task, what do they need, what equipment do they need, so you're helping them with their organisation. You're breaking the task down into manageable chunks, so what do I need to do? You're helping them with those executive functioning skills of planning, which can be really tricky, and also it gives you a chance to be able to set them off on the task, but then come back and tick those boxes or help them to tick them off so that they're getting that positive feedback. And also thinking about how long they're going to be doing it, so you're really breaking everything down for them. Visual reminders, so it might be post-its on their desks reminding them of something that they've got to do. And also just having visual prompts for everything on the board so that they can remember what to do, and it also helps to really focus their attention in if they've got that dual coding. And also right at the outset, these task plans can be great, but they're not always necessary, but just making sure that they understand what to do, because it may well be that in a long input or even a short input, they may have not been focusing their attention because they find it so difficult. And so rather than them having to kind of feel embarrassed about not knowing what to do, or then it being communicated through their behaviour that they don't know what to do, approaching them right at the outset and supporting them with knowing what to do can be really helpful. Just to continue these strategies, The next one we've got on the list is using challenges or timers. So maybe setting them a little challenge. I want you to have got to this point or have done this sentence before I next come back. You can tick it off their task board. Or using timers can sometimes be helpful to build up the time that they're able to focus on independent work. Avoid the split attention effect. So for children with ADHD, it can be really difficult to look at what they're doing, look up at the board, find their way of shifting their attention back to what they're doing. That can be really tricky. So rather than needing them to split their attention, having resources there for them so that they can work on a resource or have a photocopy or a handout ready rather than having to copy things down. Support them with organisation, equipment and homework. So sometimes they might fall at the first hurdle when they come to a lesson because maybe they haven't got the equipment that they needed and they haven't had that organisation. But if you can approach them right at the outset, make sure they've got everything that they need for that lesson and help them with their organisation. Things like these to-do lists that you can get can be really helpful to support that organisation and support them in being more independent, but supporting them initially in doing so, and also checking that they've got their homework written down just to support that organisation so that they're not ending up getting in trouble right at the start of the lesson for things that actually are really difficult for them. Encourage movement breaks and use of timeout cards. That can be things just within the classroom. It can even be within their seats, so sort of chair press-ups or running an errand, giving out the books so that they're getting a bit of heavy work and a bit of sensory feedback as well. Lots of immediate praise. Supporting impulse control during whole class discussions, so allowing them to maybe if they find it really difficult not to shout out the answers, standing next to them and allowing them to whisper the answers to you or write them down on a whiteboard and show you. Building relationships with them is absolutely key. Understanding them, making them feel good about themselves, making them feel good in the relationship that you have with you, letting them know that you really like them and you want to help them. And also asking them what they feel that they need and what would help them is so crucial. Emotion coaching can be really helpful in this situation. You can find another webinar all about emotion coaching that goes through the steps, but just generally being able to empathise and listen and sometimes recognise emotions in children with ADHD and other children, but being curious about the emotion that they're feeling and labelling it for them through phrases like, I'm just wondering if you're starting to feel a little bit frustrated because this is really difficult. Maybe we could go for a little walk and then come back before we get started. So emotion coaching in that way can be really helpful. And just gradually reducing the support over time, because what you're aiming for is to give them that support but also build up that independence. And if the child or student has access to an iPad, whether in school or at home, there are some apps that can be really helpful for children with ADHD. So the ChoiceWorks calendar is a visual calendar that can help with organisation. Focus Booster uses the Pomodoro technique, so it gets them to focus for a set amount of time and then encourages them to have a break and then focus again and then have a break. Habitica is an app that encourages you to kind of put your to-do list on there and then it rewards you through, and it's kind of like a game, so it's like a platform game format where they get points and earn coins for having done things on their to-do list, so that can be quite helpful with organisation and motivation. Forest is a great app for focusing attention, so especially if they're getting distracted by things on their phone. So with the Forest app, when they put it on, the longer that they leave their phone unfiddled with, the plant will grow. But as soon as they go off the Forest app and onto their WhatsApp or other apps that they've got that they might be distracted by, the plant dies. So it encourages them to avoid distraction. Audible for listening to books being read to them, because that can be quite tricky sometimes to pay attention and actually really take in what the book is saying when reading. Focus at Will is an app that has lots of music on there that's designed for helping to focus attention. Evernote is a note-taking app that is recommended for pupils with ADHD because it can support with organisation and keeping everything in very kind of clear folders. Todoist is a to-do list which can be helpful on an iPad, and obviously Headspace is the mindfulness app, which literally trains you to focus your attention and ignore distractions. So that can be quite helpful for some pupils with ADHD as well. And lastly, we're just going to have a little look at the strengths of pupils with ADHD, because we've talked a lot about the things that are more difficult for pupils with ADHD, and the way that schools are designed creates difficulty for pupils with ADHD. But it's also, I think, our responsibility to identify and harness and nurture the strengths of pupils with ADHD as well. And it's oversimplistic to be able to say that everybody with ADHD has a certain strength. However, this diagram just gives you some examples of the kinds of things that pupils with ADHD may be really good at. And it's through those relationships with pupils that you'll be able to identify their strengths and really nurture them and boost their self-esteem. Dav Pilkey is a lovely example of somebody with ADHD, a child with ADHD, who triumphed against the school system, which can be so challenging for pupils with ADHD. So in his About the Authors section in his famous book about Captain Underpants, about a superhero called Captain Underpants, it said, when Dav Pilkey was a kid, he suffered from ADHD, dyslexia and behavioural problems. He was so disruptive in class that his teachers asked him to sit out in the hall every day. Fortunately, he loved to draw and make up stories, and he spent his time in the hallway creating his own original comic books. In the second grade, Dav Pilkey created a comic book about a superhero named Captain Underpants. His teacher ripped it up and told him that he couldn't spend the rest of his life making silly books. Fortunately, Dav was not a very good listener. And lastly, before we finish, just some areas of discussion to have a think about. Firstly, what do you do well already to support pupils with ADHD? Secondly, what else could you try to make life easier for a student with ADHD that you work with? And lastly, if you were going to make an ADHD grab bag that you could take to lessons to support pupils as and when they needed it, particularly those with ADHD, what would you put in that bag? Thanks so much for listening.